Nicolaus Tideman. And he received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1969, taught at Harvard, and then served as a senior staff economist for the President's Council of Economic Research, Council of Economic Advisors in 1970-71. That's in the White House. He's a senior advisor there. Since then, basically since '73, he's been a professor of economics at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. He's focused on urban economics, public finance, and efficient public decision making. He's been helping us to make suggestions on the Monetary Transparency Act, and we're going to have a short meeting right after his talk. We'll break for lunch early because we need to have a working group that is working on that. Professor Tideman's going to discuss the generally ignored precondition or conditions before which free market concepts could really be applied in a moral manner. For example, leveling the playing field. Please welcome Professor Tideman.
If I want to advance the slide.
All right.
Last year, when Steve asked me to talk, I told him I wanted to talk what I wanted to talk about. You got to talk on quick money. I think a lot of you thought that I was just talking a joke, but I was serious about that. But I decided that, to be fair to Steve, this year I'd let him choose my title, and he chose the title of Leveling the Playing Field. So I got to thinking, what do we mean by leveling the playing field? That's a subject that's of some interest to me. And it seemed to me that the idea of leveling the playing field could best be described as ending privilege. Okay. Privilege is a word that we hear a lot of. Do you know where it comes from? You have some Latin scholars here. Don't remember hearing somebody I guess it was David yesterday who said he was had studied Latin for so many years. Is David Kelly here? Yeah. What?
It's not making you remember it,
What?
You're not going to make you try to remember it, are you?
Oh, I hope. Well, I hope I could. But maybe some others. Yes, Susan. Yeah. Well, yes. Privilege. Yes, comes from the Latin words prive and lege. And so, privilege is private law. What's a private law? Anybody know what a private law is? Yeah. A private law is a law that has somebody's name in it. And so, a private law is a law that allows one person to do what other people are not allowed to do. That's what privilege is. That's the very opposite of leveling the playing field, isn't it? It seems to me if we want to level the playing field, we want to get rid of privilege. What? Try. No, look. Yeah, that's what you want, yeah. Okay, now, let's see.
It's a challenge.
No, we are leveling the field, there it is. Okay. Right. Privilege privilege, private law. Law that has its own name, and law that allows someone to do what others are not allowed to do. So the next question is, what is the right amount of privilege? And I suggest that it's none, right? From which it follows that no one is ever underprivileged. How can anyone ever be underprivileged if the right amount of privilege is none? People can be disadvantaged, but they can't be underprivileged. Hark, hark, the dogs do bark. Anybody recognize that?
What do you know of it?
I think of it as Mother Goose. Hark, hark, the dogs do bark. What comes next? The beggars are coming to town. Anybody recognize this from your youth? Some in rags, some in tags, and some in velvet gowns. Now, when my father would read Mother Goose rhymes to me, I'd ask, what are these guys doing begging if they got velvet gowns? Well, there's a lot of interesting political commentary in Mother Goose. Mother Goose rhymes originated when political commentary was dangerous and had to be coded. What this says is that there are a bunch of rich guys coming to London to ask the king for special privileges. And they already got velvet gowns and they don't need it. Now, privilege has a long history to it. And some of it is told in Mother Goose. Now, I want to take you through a bunch of forms of privilege. I think we need to understand the many forms that privilege takes. Now, one of the most obvious forms of privilege is a government-prescribed monopoly. Sometimes in England, the king would say, okay, you're the only guy who can grind grain in Norwich, or whatever it might be. And the guy who had the monopoly on grinding grain in Norwich could make a lot of money because he could charge whatever price the market could bear. I live in Blacksburg, Virginia. There was only one company that was allowed to take passengers back and forth between Blacksburg and the airport. All kinds of cases arise in our country where the government says you can do it and nobody else can. Government-granted monopolies are a form of privilege. Now, I'm going to be commenting on a variety of forms of privilege, including a number that you may be involved in yourself. So before I did that, I thought I would take next one. Oh dear, I didn't update the version of this that went onto the stick, but that's all right. That's all right. I'll get by with that. I'll just go back. Whoops. And talk about one that's farther down on my list that applies to me. When I was 18 years old, I had to register for the draft. And I applied for classification as a conscientious objector. Now that's a form of privilege, isn't it? We're going to draft people and send them off to Vietnam, but you don't have to go because you think war is wrong. Now, never was determined whether I was qualified to be conscientious objector because I got another form of privilege instead. I got deferments as a student. But think about the idea that we're going to have a draft and send people off to war, and some people don't have to go because they think that war is wrong. There's something fundamentally unfair about that. I was very conflicted about the idea of applying for status as a conscientious objector. At that time, the law was that in order to be a conscientious objector, you had to have a religious and not a philosophical objection to war, and I wasn't sure whether my objection qualified as religious or not. In my mind, although I never met with the draft board to discuss the subject, I had lots of imaginary conversations with them. And eventually, it seemed to me it came down to this, that I thought, I wasn't entirely sure that I would never kill anybody in a war, but I thought the question of who I killed was a very important decision, and not one that I was willing to delegate to anybody else. If I was ever going to kill somebody and I had to explain why I did it, I wasn't going to rely on saying, well, I was told to do it, so I did it. And it seemed to me I would have to refrain from joining the army if I wasn't prepared to take orders. So That was my position, but it never went farther than that. But as I said, I was very conflicted about the idea of asking for classification as a conscientious objector. I learned somewhere that it wasn't particularly compassion that led to the idea of classification as a conscientious objector. It was concern for the morale in the army. There was a time when if somebody refused to fight, they'd shoot him. But it turned out that that had a very demoralizing effect on the other soldiers. Here they see somebody who says, no, I think war is wrong and I don't want to kill people, they kill him. The other guy sort of loses interest in killing people after that. So as a way of keeping morale up, they decided they had to figure out who these guys were as long as it didn't cost them too many and get them out of the way without causing too much disruption to the other troops. Okay, that's a form of privilege that I applied for. An agricultural quota. Under many of our agricultural programs, you have a sugar quota, a peanut quota, whatever it might be. You are designated as having the right to grow a certain amount of particular crop and other people aren't allowed to grow it. That sounds to me like a privilege. A sinecure. A sinecure is a government job for which you don't have to do any work. You get paid anyway. That sounds to me like a privilege. Liquor license. It varies from state to state, but some states where they only let you sell liquor if they decide there aren't too many people already selling liquor. You convince them that the community can tolerate another liquor establishment, and then you get your liquor license, and you can do it and other people can't. Sounds to me like privilege. The zoning exception. We have ideas about how the community ought to look, and somebody comes along and says he wants to do things differently, and we consider it and we say, okay, that's what the rules are for everybody else, but you will make an exception for you. Put one person's name in the law, private law, sounds like privilege to me. So there's conscientious objector status, which I already described. Bank charter. That sounds to me like a privilege. Now, if anybody wants to can open a bank, then opening a bank isn't a privilege. It's just something that some people do and other people don't. But if you have to convince a government official that you should be allowed to open a bank when other people aren't allowed to, well, that's a privilege. Something we wouldn't have if we had a level playing field. And then, a patent of nobility. A patent of nobility is a piece of paper that says that you can collect the rent from a certain amount of land. You're special. And generalizing, I would argue that every land title is a privilege. Now, we don't have to have titles for pianos and other things. We have titles for cars because the car insurance companies wanted them. But we could get along perfectly well without a system of government recorded titles for cars. But we need a system of government recorded titles for land. Now, I haven't checked this with Michael in advance, but I'm going to make a prediction, maybe he will know. I would say that if you show me a nation, a society, that has a system where people can buy and sell land, that would be a society that has writing. He's nodding his head yes. You can't have transfers of land. It's exceedingly difficult to have a society where you can have transfers of land if you don't have a way of recording who is the privileged person who has access to each parcel of land. Now, you could divide up the land every year in some way where everybody got to use of the same amount without a system of writing. But you can't have land bought and sold without a system of writing, I believe. You might be able to do it, but it'd be extremely difficult to make it work over time. So land titles are a form of privilege. Now, when we think about what a world would be like without privilege, we're going to have to give up the idea of land titles altogether? That would be very unproductive. In the case of some things that are privileged the way we do them now, we could have a society without privilege by saying whoever it is that has the claim on this particular exclusive right has to pay the rest of us for not getting in his way. And that's how I look at land value taxation. Exclusive access to land is a privilege. Privileges are fundamentally unjust. But we can take this injustice and turn it into something that satisfies the criteria of justice if we say whoever has a land title pays the rest of us the rental value of land. Then we are all equal with respect to being able to get some value from these opportunities. So I've run through a number of variations on the theme of privilege, and now I would like to talk about a related class of things which I will call privilege-like devices. They're not exactly privileged, but they have something in common with privilege, and they need to be considered carefully if we want to think about having a society with a level playing field, a society without privilege. And my first example there is protective tariffs. If you say some industries get protected from foreign competition and others don't, you don't have to put anybody's name in the law exactly, but you have to put certain goods in the law. And we're not all equally adept at producing all goods, so whoever it is that has the talent or the particular resources for producing those goods is advantaged unequally. He's given some unequal treatment compared to the rest of us. So in my idea of a society with a level playing field, there would be no protective tariffs. Similarly, another privilege-like device is the subsidy. If you say, if you produce peanuts, you get a subsidy, or if you produce software programs, you get a subsidy, or whatever it is you might want to think gets a subsidy, well, that looks rather like privilege to me. Now, I would say that there are going to be some cases where you can argue that there are some general social benefits from particular activity, that we don't want only the quantity we would get if we didn't have a subsidy. Parking garages might be an example. We might decide that the number of parking garages in the downtown area has a big impact on how viable the downtown area is as a shopping center. And we could put up some commercial parking garages, we could put up municipal parking garages, but we might think that the private sector has better talent for managing parking garages than the public sector. So what we'll do is we'll say anybody who puts up a parking garage gets a subsidy of so many dollars per year for every parking space, and we'll make it up in the extra value of the surrounding land which you can collect through taxes. Now there's a subsidy that has some economic coherence to it and might actually be a good idea. And it might be that the proponents of every kind of subsidy could come up with some such argument. And some of those arguments would be valid and others wouldn't. And we'd have to learn to distinguish very carefully between the valid arguments for subsidy and the invalid arguments. And it's going to be quite a trick, but it might be better to try to make that distinction rather than to say that there's going to be a blanket prohibition on all subsidies. Now the advocates of protective tariffs are going to come up with arguments of that sort too. And what I would say is that the economists who have studied the idea of trade and tariffs have come to the pretty unanimous conclusion that if there's something that's worth doing that you might want to do through protective tariff, you can do it more efficiently through a subsidy. That it's probably not a good idea to try to manage your trade through tariffs. More devices that are like privilege. Excuse me, wrong button. pork rail project. What's a pork rail project? A government project where everybody pays from all around the country and all the benefits go to people in one area. It's the fundamental device that politicians use to make themselves popular with their constituents and get reelected. There's a lot of grumbling about pork rail projects, but we haven't really found a way yet to wean ourselves off of them. The pork rail project's benefits go to the powerful people in society, and they manage to convince the rest of society not to interfere with that process. Pretty much so far, although there's grumbling on the edges here and there. I would say that if a project is worth doing, that's because the benefits are greater than the costs. And so there's some way of undertaking it where all the financing comes from the people who get from the benefits. You shouldn't have to get a subsidy from everybody else all around the country in order to undertake a project that's worthwhile in a given area. Now, it may be that there is some general benefit from the whole country that justifies the nationwide subsidy. I can imagine that in the abstract, it's my judgment that in almost all cases where that argument is made, it's fallacious, and what we have is people using their political power to extract some benefits for themselves at the expense of others. Tax exemptions. We all get tax exemptions of one kind or another. Tax exemptions for children, tax exemptions for charitable contributions, tax exemptions for mortgage interest, tax exemptions for state and local taxes. There are lots and lots of tax exemptions corresponding to the lines on the tax forms that I never bother with, but I'm sure that they're very valuable to some people. And then the tax form says, well, anything else that excuses you for not paying taxes, put it down here and then tell us about it on another piece of paper. And I can't imagine what all the things are that go into that category, but I know there must be lots and lots. People having persuaded Congress that should be, well, we don't put people's names in the law, but every now and then we say, well, if you make both bicycles and hair dryers, and you do this in at least 7 states, and you've been in business for 10 years at least, but not more than 50 years, then you get this tax exemption. Now, Michael, can you confirm that there are laws of that approximate nature? I've heard about them in the paper from every now and then, although I never actually read them.
I'll say that the tax code could be done in 10 pages, and all the other 42 volumes are all your tax exemptions.
Yes.
The small print.
Yeah. So there's lots and lots of privilege-like devices that are in our society in the form of tax exemptions. If we were doing things really right, we would have the tax code in those 10 pages and forget the other 42 volumes. Now here's another controversial one for you, and that's a patent. A patent is a form of a government-prescribed monopoly. Now, it's not exactly according to the definition of privilege, because we don't put the person's name in the law. We put his name on the patent in another component of the government. But when I say that a patent is a privilege, people are going to feel a bit uncomfortable with that, because they say, well, if you don't give the creator some kind of benefit, how would we induce people to undertake the invention? We would get a lot less invention if we didn't provide patents. And so patents have some rationale to them. I have the opinion that we give inventors a lot more than we ought to. We used to be that patents were 17 years. Now, under the rules of the World Trade Organization, we've increased that to 20 years. And I think that's just too long. A patent of 5 years I could probably live with. But I also object to classifying a patent as intellectual property. When you begin to call it property, it sounds as if people have a right to it. And I would say, no, you don't have a right to it. You have a right to yourself, but when you take your talent and you turn it into an idea, and rather than into a thing, you don't have a right to the idea. It may be that we want to encourage you to do that, and we give you some kind of a privilege, some kind of a temporary monopoly in order to encourage you to do that. But that's not property. That's a grace on our part to you. And so I would say the same thing about copyrights. Copyrights are a form of privilege that makes some kind of sense because they, the prospect of a copyright induces songwriters and script writers and novelists to give us things that we wouldn't otherwise have. But I have the impression that most of the income from copyrights goes to lawyers and accountants, and not all that much to the creators. I think we would make the artist better off if we were to say, okay, instead of the present copyrights, we'll give you a copyright of just 2 years and no income tax on those 2 years. When the book sells, in almost all cases, the vast portion of the sales come in the first 2 years. If you want to say, well, for certain kinds of scholarly works, maybe longer, I would refrain from making that argument on myself because I'm a scholar and I don't want to be in the position of special pleading. So I'd be prepared to get by with 2 years. Okay, so here I've taken you through a lot of examples of privilege and a lot of examples of privilege-like devices. But this is a conference on money. So now I'd like to take these ideas and ask, how do they apply to money? Well, one I've already talked about, and that's discretionary bank charters. If we had a system that had a level playing field, anybody who wanted to could open a bank. Or else the banks would be public institutions. I think we'd probably be better off trying to find rules under which anybody could open a bank. But we have to be careful about that because if the banks go belly up, we can have very bad consequences for the whole economy. That was part of the lesson of 1929. And what we did about it in 1929 was we came up with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Federal Savings Loan Insurance Corporation as a device for telling people, look, you don't have to worry about the possibility of a run on the bank. There's not going to be one because everybody's got insurance. Well, it turned out we found out in the late 1980s that everybody's got insurance can mean that taxpayers come up with $500 billion to bail out the industry that's done a bunch of dumb things. So when we have deposit insurance, we have to have some kind of government supervision. Well, we could have the insurance company go bust, but we don't want to have that either because that would ruin the economy. So as was mentioned the other day, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation has reserves corresponding to about 1.25% of the deposits that it's insuring. And it cannot, from its own assets at present, cover anything like a general decline in, or general collapse of the banking sector. But the economists that I talk to say that everybody understands that if there ever is any need of the FDIC for resources beyond what it has, the Fed will just print the money and give it to them, as happened with the savings and loan debacle. So if we have deposit insurance for everybody, then we have to have government supervision of the banks, and we can't just let anybody who wants to open a bank and run it the way he wants to. So it makes banks somewhat more like privilege-like components of the economy to be supervised by the government in order to get the benefits of deposit insurance. And this is one of the reasons why I think we need, as Steve suggests, a system of 100% reserves for demand deposits. With the 100% reserves, there can't be that kind of problem with the banks. I also think, just as a matter of ordinary honesty, if you're going to say to people, anytime you want your money, just go to the bank and it'll be there for you, then it ought to be there. This idea of telling people, put your money in the bank and you can get it any time, it's a demand deposit. That means you can get it whenever you want, and everybody can get it at the same time if they all want it at the same time. That seems to me just dishonest. Now, I should say that I'm doubtful that the consequences of 100% reserves would be the same as Steve predicts. So let me just talk a little bit about that. It seems to me that the scenario that I hear Steve describing would have no elasticity to the demand for demand deposits. Let me explain what I mean by that. Right now, you put the money in the bank and you get maybe 1 or 2% interest per year. Under 100% reserves, you put your money in the bank and they charge you 1 or 2% per year. Demand deposits would be a lot less popular under those rules. People would find other ways of paying their bills. I think that we would have people using devices like perhaps money market accounts, or maybe you would take a mutual fund account and have an arrangement with the broker that if you need to pay your gas bill, you send a piece of paper to the gas company that says, take this to my broker and they'll sell a certain number of shares in my mutual fund, enough to pay you the $184 I owe you for my gas this month. So we would find things, more and more things acting as substitutes for money, and fewer and fewer things in this category of demand deposits where it costs you to hold on to them. So I think the demand deposits would decline greatly under a system in which they had to be backed by 100% reserves. But I still think that we ought to have a rule that says if you have demand deposits, that means the money is there in the vaults. And that's part of what is needed in order to end privilege. Now, my next example of applications of privilege to money is controversial and an area where I'm inclined to disagree with Steve, but let's talk about it a bit. That's government issues of money to support unpopular expenditures. Now, you talk about the Iraq War today, I guess it's becoming increasingly popular. I remember thinking about this first in connection with the Vietnam War. Johnson wanted to fight a war. He didn't want to tell people they had to pay for the war, so he arranged to finance the war by borrowing money, essentially by generating credit. It resulted in inflation. And so there are times when the capacity of government to issue money is used as a device for giving a kind of privilege to government officials. It says to them, you don't need to go to the voters to get approval for what you want to do. Just print yourself some money and that way you can do it. It's not exactly privilege, but it's what looks to me like excessive power to government officials, which I find distressing. So my version of a just monetary system would involve using the creation of money as a source for a citizen's dividend. You want to increase the money supply? Put the same number of dollars in everybody's bank account. Now, at the same time, I recognize that there may be a good political reason for Steve to do things his way rather than my way. And that is that if you propose a change in the monetary system that gives more power to mayors and county boards of supervisors and governors and legislatures, you have a better chance of getting that through than if you propose to get a few $100s a year to everybody in the country. It's easier to organize the political support for a program that concentrates the benefits on some powerful people. So it might be that if it's going to happen at all, it has to happen his way. And if so, I'll say, okay, that's the best we can do. So now, to close, I'd like to go through my list of what would be necessary to level the monetary playing field. First, require that demand deposits be stored. Second, when money supply is increased, give equal amounts to all citizens. But then the two special provisions: whenever a citizen turns 18, give him or her, give a citizen who turns 18 his or her share of the money supply. When we have more citizens, we need more money. All the money that's there got there at essentially zero cost. We got another person, we need more money to run the economy with more people. Give them their tokens to play the game with the rest of us. Now, that makes people who turn 18 in the future in a way privileged over those who have turned 18 in the past. And that discontinuity is somewhat problematic. And I'm not sure exactly what the best transition mechanism is from where we are to this ideal. But it seems to me that if we ever did get to the ideal, that's where it would be. And then, as the other half of that, expect a citizen who dies or emigrates to return the distribution of money that he or she received. So that's my version of leveling the monetary playing field. Any questions or comments?
Thank you, Nick. I'm sure we're going to have some questions.
Thank you. I think I told you yesterday that I have come over to the colonies to learn. And I'm fascinated by your take on the general ideas of what we do to create a sustainable economy, and your argument about a level playing field, and you admitted to an issue which you said that you were in conflict with Stephen.
Yes.
Now, well, conflict's a bit of a strong word.
Okay, well, different perspectives.
Thank you. I find that fascinating because I think I also mentioned that I don't see it as an either-or situation. I see it as a fluctuating, maybe we do this, or maybe we do that. Your view of what in Europe is the big debate about what used to be called the national dividend, my own party call it the citizen's income, I think is a good one. Giving into the pockets of the consumer, you call them voting chips, and I think that's a really marvellous term. You know, just like gambling chips, you can go and spend them on what you choose to spend them on. But there is a point on Stephen's side of this where the government themselves have got to enter in. The government has got to enter into the debating chamber and say, we're appealing to you as voters to put us into power on this particular program.
Yes.
And we want to do this, and this. It's then down to the counters, the bean counters, to say, well, our economy can sustain this year, and there'll be a surplus which we can maybe put into this. Whatever word you use, my favourite word is actually the dividend.
Yeah.
And that might fluctuate over time.
Yes.
But there's precedent to this. If you go back into English history concerning the growth of our parliament, well, in the early days, what parliaments were called together to a term called voting supply. And that was exactly that. The king and his council would go into the parliament and say, we want to go and fight the French this year, but we'll leave the Scots until next year. Now, come on, you lot, we want the money to do it.
Yes.
They'd all sort of
Right.
look at each other and say, well, how much is that each?
Yes.
So this balance of power
Right.
is what
Yes, okay.
I believe you and Steve are talking about.
Okay, well,
is that your view?
Yeah, well, I think that the disagreement is relatively small, but it seems to me that rather than start out with the government having all the money and say, you know, we're going to keep this money when we could give it back to you, I'd like to start out with people having the money and the government saying, well, there's this money that we're prepared to turn over you as to your share of the dividends, but how about giving some of it up to us so we can undertake these expenditures? So it's a very small difference as to what the starting point should be from which debate starts. But there's a sense in which Steve's idea is equivalent from mine once people get the idea that instead of not allowing the government to keep this money, they could always use it to finance a tax cut.
I think there's a common denominator. Nick and I have been discussing these ideas for over 10 years. All of the forms of privilege that he described yield an income, and that income is not profit. It's in technical terms, it's economic rent. And it happens that what banks lend against really isn't primarily profits, because they're not interested in that. They're interested in economic rent. That's why they lend to real estate. That's why they lend to monopolies. That's why they lend to the public utilities, which are monopolies, and to the oil and gas industry. So I think the bridge is that if the economic rent is not used to pay interest to the banking system, you're going to have an awful lot of it in the economy. All this money that's going to paying interest now is going to be available. And you don't want it concentrated in any part of the pyramid. So what Nick's suggestion means is that this is not only the natural tax base, so that you won't have to tax labor, you won't have to tax industry, but there's so much economic rent available from the value of land and monopolies that it should be equally distributed to citizens. And what he's suggesting is a natural complement to the 100% reserves, because if the flow doesn't go to the banking system, it should basically go to the people, because it's economic rent, not a return to labor or capital.
Yeah. So I'm providing an intellectual framework in which the different parts fit together nicely.
I'll make a comment on that in a moment, but first, Robert Petit has his hand up here. Okay. Well, I agree that I wrote some ideas down here. This, turning 18 and getting a dividend. I like that a lot. I think part of our reasoning, Nick, in the way we've structured this, and when you say it's my idea, it really came out of the Chicago plan, largely, except for the third part of it, which is the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And regarding the infrastructure, the American Society of Civil Engineers tell us that we're 1.6 trillion behind.
Well,
Let me finish. That type of expenditure, and that's for those are the things that make society possible: railroads, roads, and so on. It's not easy to do those things through individual effort. That's the type of thing that has to be done by government. So at least at the start of this, I would think that we would look at it in that way.
well, my guess is that if I had a chance to vote on these things, I would vote in favor of them myself. They sound to me like very worthwhile projects. But at a philosophical level, as to how you draw the line between the things that are worth doing and the things that aren't worth doing, it's at that point that I would like to say, even at the risk of leaving some good things undone, I'd like to try to be democratic about it and make sure that everything that governments do gets approved by citizens because they find it worth what it costs them, rather than getting done because government figures out that it's a good thing to do, and any way they can do it with or without the government, with or without citizen approval, is a good thing to do.
Got it. Well, ours,
Yeah, so, but I,
you understand our citizen
yes,
approval comes through the Congress, but what we're proposing still requires congressional approval
yes,
for everything.
yes, it's a relatively small disagreement.
I'm gonna disagree with both Nick and Steve in a relatively minor way. It sounds wonderful to give an 18-year-old a dividend. However, that goes against the principle that when you increase the money supply, you increase production. What I would much rather do is give the 18-year-old a job and pay him for it.
Well, I'd like to have an economy that made it very easy for 18-year-olds to get jobs. I don't think this is the right place to go into that in detail, but I agree that it's very important to not have an economy where people are left without work. But I consider that to be separate from the issue of how we deal with the money.
I'd like to come back to your comments on intellectual property patents. I can understand the benefit of having a patent to stimulate creativity, to get people to put effort into innovation and that kind of thing. But in our present economy, this seems to be another thing that has been usurped and monopolized by the corporations.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Could you comment on that?
Yes. Well, one of the things that I think is, one of the ways we got into the place we are, is that we left the discussion of patents to the people who have the greatest interest in it, who are the patent lawyers. There wasn't much consultation of the general public when the World Trade Organization came up with its rules for patents that they're trying to enforce uniformly around the globe. I think it was done for the benefit of the patent lawyers. I think it is a good idea to find some way to reward people for innovation. But very often we inhibit innovation because the person who wants to make it, the next innovation has to get the permission to use the patents of half a dozen people who went before him. And it's very difficult to get all the rights together to do anything new once they've been divided up in so many different ways. So shortening the patents would help alleviate that problem. I think it's very important to re-examine this issue in a way that involves widespread participation by informed citizens who don't have a special interest in maximizing the flow of dollars to patent holders, but rather are concerned with maximizing the benefits to the public of innovation.
Any more questions?
I think that's it. Microphone coming.
My question is how you're going to implement these ideas when the law itself is for sale by the lawyers and the judges and the politicians.
Well, the question of how we get reform is a question that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Sometimes I think I'm tempted to be in despair over that. When I see how easy it is for people to not see what they don't want to see. But the one source of optimism, I think, I get from looking backward in time. If you go back 300 years, nobody thought it would be possible to end slavery. There was such a attack on the concept of property that people regarded it as utterly impossible to end slavery. But somehow we managed to do that. There was a time, the first writings in support of equal rights for women, I believe, were the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin in about 1790. And it was another 130 years before women had the vote in this country. And when the Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed in the 60s, It was considered very controversial. We never did pass it, but I think that somehow we got to the point where the courts pretty much agree that we have the effect of the Equal Rights Amendment, even though it didn't pass. And so I think that there again, something that looked impossible at first happened. I think that it happens through a change in consciousness. It's not easy. And I'm not a political strategist. I'm just somebody who can describe what the result would look like if we ever got there. Another.
Do you really believe we have ended slavery?
Oh, excuse me, no. We have not ended slavery, thank you.
We now have a wage slavery.
Oh, well, no, we have chattel slavery too in various places around the world. But what we have ended is civilized support for slavery. So that there's nobody who asserts anymore that slavery, in civilized countries, there's nobody who defends the proposition that slavery is a good thing.
Well, our friends just yesterday, 18-year-olds should be pushed over.
But I mean, I think he meant that they should be offered a job. I don't think he would.
I will add, I think we have a basically optimistic view of progress and what's possible. And what we're promoting, what we're advocating, is going to benefit 99.999% of the population. So we have that working for us. The last question, I think.
Earlier, you threw out the percent of cash and reserves on FDIC and FSLIC, and at first you brought up 100% reserves, and then I kind of understood what you said after that, and then later I got to thinking, well, at what rate do we need reserves? How about 50%? Are either one of these workable? Would you touch on that?
It seems to me that anything you have is arbitrary. I'm not enough of a student of monetary or banking history and theory to have a well-formed opinion. And so it's just, my idea of 100% reserves is just based on principles of having language mean what it says. It's not based on practicality. Well, the trouble with 50% is that then when somebody goes down to 49%, you got to shut them down. Banks were going to have excess reserves, and then they lose their excess reserves. They're still going to go bankrupt or be unable to satisfy the reserve requirements from time to time.
It's probably easier to get 100% than 50%, because if you try for 50%, you've given up the moral landscape. You know, murder is half good. So, Nick, thank you very much.